Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Siege of Constantinople. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The Bosphorus is still tonight, and the water holds the last light of the day in long, trembling bars of copper and rose. On one shore, the dark mass of the city. On the other, the gentle hills of Asia, already deep in shadow, their ridgelines dissolving into a sky the color of old wine. The strait is narrow here, barely half a mile across at its most slender point, and in this stillness you can hear things clearly: the lap of small waves against stone, the distant call of a muezzin drifting down from somewhere on a hill, the creak of a mooring rope. The water between the two shores is not simply water. It has always been something more than water, a threshold, a seam in the world where Europe and Asia press together without quite touching, separated by this cold and ancient channel that runs from the Black Sea in the north down to the Sea of Marmara in the south, carrying with it the melted snows of far mountains and the memories of 1,000 voyages, 10,000 crossings, the weight of every army and every merchant and every exile who has ever made this passage and looked back at the shore receding behind them. The sky above the strait darkens from the east. The stars are patient, and they are coming. Tonight we settle into one of the most consequential moments in the long history of the ancient world, the final days of Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, in the spring of the year 1453. We will not rush through it, and we will not reduce it to the drama of winners and losers. This is the story of a city that had stood for more than 1,100 years as the capital of an empire, a city of extraordinary beauty and faith and learning and human complexity, and of the night it became something else. Let the Bosphorus carry you now. Let the sound of that quiet water be the beginning. We have time. The night is long, and the city is worth knowing. To understand what Constantinople was in 1453, you must hold in your mind a very long span of time. The city had been founded in the year 330 of the Common Era by the Roman Emperor Constantine I, Constantine the Great, who chose the site of the ancient Greek town of Byzantium for a new eastern capital of his empire, and who spent enormous resources to make it worthy of that ambition. The site was extraordinary. A peninsula jutting into the confluence of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara, water on three sides, the narrow strip of land to the west defended by walls. It was among the most defensible positions in the known world. Constantine built palaces and forums and a hippodrome for chariot races that could hold 100,000 people. He brought statues and artworks and scholars and craftsmen from across the empire. He built a great cathedral, and then another. And he built walls, and then more walls, and then, in the early 5th century, the emperors who came after him built the walls that would define the city for 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls, triple-layered, 5 kilometers long, studded with 96 towers, so well engineered that they had repelled every attacker who had ever come against them in more than 1,000 years of continuous siege, assault, and attempted conquest. For 11 centuries, the city endured. Barbarian kingdoms rose and fell in the western half of the old Roman Empire, and Constantinople kept calling itself Rome. Because it was Rome, the Rome that had survived, the Rome that had not fallen. The emperors who ruled from its great palaces by the water's edge styled themselves as the heirs of Augustus and Julius Caesar. They wore purple, which was the imperial color, and they ruled from a throne room designed to overawe visitors with the machinery of divine majesty. Mechanical golden lions that roared, mechanical golden birds that sang. A throne that rose on pulleys to lift the emperor above ordinary human level. A space designed to make clear that you were in the presence of something more than a man. The city filled with churches, hundreds of churches, gilded and frescoed and lit by the light of 10,000 oil lamps. At its center, the Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and at the time of its completion the largest building in the world, a dome that seemed to float without support, lit by a ring of windows that made the light appear to pour in from somewhere beyond the physical, a space that made grown men weep when they first entered it. Ambassadors sent by the princes of the Rus to report on the religions they had encountered returned from the Hagia Sophia and said, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." The city in its greatest centuries had been home to perhaps 500,000 people, a number that made it the largest city in Europe, larger than Rome itself had become. Larger than anything in the medieval West. Its markets were legendary, the silk bazaars, the spice merchants, the dealers in icons and manuscripts, the goldsmiths and silversmiths and ivory carvers who worked in the narrow streets of the commercial quarters behind the great forums. Greek was the language of the city, but the streets rang with Arabic and Slavic and Latin and Armenian and the dialects of a dozen Italian city-states, whose merchants had been granted trading rights within the city walls for centuries. The Venetians had their own quarter, their own docks, their own churches. The Genoese had theirs. The great cathedral of the Pantocrator housed the library of the emperors, manuscripts in Ge'ez and Arabic and Latin alongside the Greek texts that had come down from antiquity, works by Aristotle and Plato and Euclid and Ptolemy that existed here in copies when the originals had long since crumbled to dust in Alexandria or Athens. Constantinople was, for much of its existence, the most intellectually sophisticated city in the Christian world. The ordinary life of the city in its great centuries was remarkable in ways that no single account can fully capture. Think of the markets, the Misi, the great central avenue that ran from the Golden Gate in the west all the way to the Augustan, the great forum at the heart of the city, lined on both sides with colonnaded shops whose merchants sold everything the ancient and medieval world produced. Bolts of Byzantine silk in colors that the West could not replicate. Dyed in the shades that would later be called imperial purple and the deep crimson that was reserved for the fabrics of the powerful. The silk workshops of Constantinople were state monopolies, their techniques guarded with the care that states reserve for military secrets. Their weavers workers of extraordinary skill who produced cloth so fine that when it was held up to the light the threads seemed to disappear. Food came to the city's markets from across the Black Sea and the Aegean and the Mediterranean, salted fish from the Pontic shores, grain from the fields of Thrace and the Crimea, olive oil in great ceramic amphorae from the islands, honey and wax from the hives of the Danube plain, spices that had traveled from India through the intermediaries of the Islamic world. The people of Constantinople were, by the standards of the medieval world, extraordinarily literate. The city had schools that continued, in adapted form, traditions of education that went back to the academies of ancient Athens. Boys of the upper classes studied rhetoric and philosophy and mathematics and astronomy alongside the scriptures. Some women, the daughters of the educated classes, read and wrote and in some cases composed poetry and theological treatises of real sophistication. The historian Anna Komnene, writing in the 12th century, produced a biography of her father the Emperor Alexios that is one of the most accomplished works of historical prose in the medieval world in any language, written with a combination of filial devotion and shrewd analytical intelligence that makes it, 8 centuries later, still genuinely fascinating to read. The intellectual life of Constantinople was not a pale shadow of ancient Greek learning but a living tradition that engaged seriously with the ancient texts, argued about them, built upon them, and produced its own original contributions in theology and philosophy and science. But by the year 1453, things had changed. The long decline had been gradual, then suddenly rapid, then catastrophic. The Fourth Crusade, that extraordinary disaster of the year 1204, when crusading armies that had set out to fight for the Christian faith in the Holy Land had instead turned and sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, with a ferocity that left its inhabitants stunned with incomprehension, had hollowed the city in ways that never fully healed. The Crusaders had looted the churches, melted down the ancient bronzes, stolen the relics that had been the pride of Byzantine piety for centuries. They had established a Latin empire in this city that lasted for half a century before a Byzantine dynasty reclaimed it, but the city that was reclaimed was diminished, poorer, less populous, its trade routes partially redirected toward Italian ports, its political authority contracted. The centuries that followed were centuries of slow shrinkage. Plague came, and came again. The population fell. The palaces that had housed 500,000 people now housed perhaps 50,000. Vast stretches within the walls had been abandoned, given over to orchards and gardens and grazing land, the great marble buildings of 1,000 years standing empty and crumbling in the spring rain. And surrounding this diminished city, the Ottoman Empire was rising. The Ottomans had been a small Turkish principality in northwestern Anatolia less than 2 centuries earlier, one of many such principalities that had emerged from the fragmentation of the Seljuk Sultanate. But they had grown, absorbed their neighbors, crossed into Europe, and spread their dominion across Thrace and the Balkans with a combination of military excellence and administrative sophistication that had made them, by the mid-15th century, the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean world. Constantinople had, for decades, been a city surrounded, its territory reduced to the city itself and a handful of villages, the Ottoman armies controlling every road that led toward it, the Byzantine emperor governing a ghost of an empire from the palace by the water's edge. The only question was when, not if. The man who decided the when was 21 years old. Sultan Mehmed II, Mehmed Han, known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, had come to the throne for the second time in 1451, after a brief first reign in his early teens that had ended with his father Murad II returning from retirement to deal with a crisis. Mehmed had watched his father's handling of events with close attention, and what he had concluded was that the thing he wanted most in the world, the conquest of Constantinople, required preparation on a scale that had never before been attempted. He spoke 6 languages. He read the histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and was conscious of himself as a figure who would be measured against them. He was capable of great cruelty, and also of genuine intellectual curiosity. He loved poetry and philosophy. He employed Greek and Italian scholars at his court, alongside the Ottoman and Islamic scholars who formed the backbone of his administration. He was, in other words, a Renaissance prince, and the Renaissance, in 1453, was just beginning to flower in the cities of Italy, in the very cities whose relationship with Constantinople was most complicated. Mehmed's preparation for the siege was meticulous and extended over years. He had a fortress built on the European side of the Bosphorus, just a few miles north of Constantinople, the Ramela Hisari, the throat cutter, its guns capable of controlling all traffic through the strait. He arranged his finances, his supply lines, his alliances. He recruited the finest military engineers of the age, including a Hungarian or Transylvanian cannon founder named Urban who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI and had been turned away. The emperor had no money to pay him, and had then taken his talents to the Sultan, who paid generously. Urban cast for Mehmed a cannon of extraordinary size, perhaps the largest ever made to that point, a bronze monster that required 60 oxen and 200 men to move, that fired stone balls weighing something in the range of 500 to 600 pounds, that took 30 minutes to reload between shots, and that produced a sound, when fired, that could be heard 30 miles away. There were other large guns as well, and hundreds of smaller ones. The Ottoman artillery train that arrived before the walls of Constantinople in the early spring of 1453 was the most formidable concentration of gunpowder weapons the world had yet seen. Let your breathing slow a little now. The detail of the weapons and the politics, set it aside for a moment. Come back to the water. The Golden Horn is the inlet of the Bosphorus that runs along the northern edge of the city's peninsula, a natural harbor of extraordinary shelter, formed in the shape of a horn. Its shores were the great commercial docks and boatyards of the Byzantine era had been. In ordinary times it would have been busy with ships. Tonight it is quiet, the water dark and calm, reflecting a sky in which the stars have fully emerged. The chain that stretched across its mouth, the great iron chain that the Byzantines had always used to close the Golden Horn against hostile ships, is in place. On the shore, torches burn at intervals. Inside the city, behind the walls, a population of perhaps 40,000 people is trying to sleep, or trying to pray, or sitting in the darkness with their hands folded and thinking about things that are too large for thought. The Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos was the last emperor of Byzantium, and he knew it. Or he must have known it, In whatever part of a man's mind holds the knowledge that is too terrible to think directly. He was in his mid-40s, a capable and dignified man who had spent years governing outlying provinces of the shrinking empire, and had come to the throne in 1449 with the full knowledge that he was inheriting a catastrophe. He had tried everything that could be tried. He had sought military assistance from the West, from the Pope, from Venice, from Genoa, from the kingdoms of Hungary and Serbia and elsewhere. He had agreed to a formal union of the Eastern and Western churches, a theological compromise deeply unpopular with most of his own people, who had a saying, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara." The union had produced almost nothing: a handful of ships from Venice, a small contingent of Genoese volunteers under a military commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, who would prove to be the finest soldier on the Byzantine side and who would play a decisive role in what was coming. The siege began on the 2nd day of April in the year 1453. The Ottoman army that positioned itself before the Theodosian walls numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men. Estimates vary, and the sources are not always trustworthy, facing a defending force inside the walls of perhaps 7,000. Of whom perhaps 2,000 were foreign volunteers. The arithmetic was stark. But the walls were extraordinary, and the defenders had the further advantage that those walls had never been taken by assault, only by treachery, in 1204. The Ottoman cannon began firing, and the stone balls struck the ancient masonry, and the ancient masonry shuddered and in places crumbled, and the defenders worked through the nights to repair the breaches with earth and timber and rubble, and in the morning the cannon fired again. This went on for 53 days. Imagine the rhythm of it, the deep, world-shaking concussion of the great cannon in the hours before dawn, the rumble of the stone ball in the air, the explosion of impact, and then the silence that followed, ringing. The defenders on the walls learned to read the rhythm. 30 minutes between shots from the great gun, less from the smaller ones, and used the intervals to shore up the crumbling sections, to drag more earth and timbers and rubble into the gaps. Giustiniani organized the defense with great skill, moving forces to threatened points, maintaining morale through personal example, standing on the walls himself where the fighting was hardest. The Emperor Constantine fought alongside his men, sleeping little, eating little, riding along the walls in the darkness to check on the state of the defenses and the state of his people. Across the water, in the harbor of the Golden Horn, the small Byzantine and Allied fleet did what it could. A pivotal moment came in late April when 4 ships, 3 Genoese vessels carrying supplies and 1 large Byzantine ship loaded with grain, attempted to break through the Ottoman naval blockade to reach the city. The Ottoman fleet, numbering perhaps 140 ships, moved to intercept them. What followed was a battle watched by tens of thousands from both shores, from the walls of the city and from the hills above. Mehmed himself reportedly rode his horse into the shallow water at the shore in his agitation, shouting orders at his naval commanders. The 4 ships fought their way through. The Ottoman fleet, larger but less maneuverable, less skillfully sailed, failed to stop them. When the 4 ships reached the safety of the Golden Horn, the cheering from inside the walls could be heard outside them. It was the last good news the defenders would receive. Inside the city, the spring was beautiful. This is not an irony so much as a fact. May in Constantinople is a month of extraordinary loveliness, the air soft and fragrant after the last cold rains, the hills green, the Judas trees blooming in that particular shade of deep rose-purple that seems to concentrate the color of the whole season. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the liturgies continued. The priests chanted in the ancient way, their voices rising into the great dome, filling the space that had been filling with the sound of prayer for 900 years. People brought their children and their icon cases and their small treasures, the rings and embroidered cloths and carved wooden crosses that were the material forms of their faith. And they sat in the colored light that came through the high windows, and they prayed with the focused intensity of people who know that prayer is the only resource they have left. There were those in the city who believed to the end that God would intervene, that as he had intervened before, in the form of storms and plagues and miraculous reversals that had saved the city from the Avars and the Arabs and the Bulgars and a dozen other armies across the centuries, he would intervene again. There were prophecies, circulating in manuscripts and whispered in churches, that spoke of a great battle at the walls and then a miraculous turning, an angel descending to the column of Constantine in the Forum to hand a sword to a simple man who would then lead the remaining defenders to victory, and drive the invaders all the way to Persia. People believed these things not because they were credulous but because they had a theology that included miracles, and they had seen the city saved before, and they were frightened. And faith is what frightened people hold on to. Mehmed, watching from his command position before the walls, was not without his own anxieties. The siege was lasting longer than he had hoped. The great cannon had done enormous damage to the walls, but the defenders kept repairing the breaches with a stubbornness that impressed even his officers. An attempt to sail Ottoman ships into the Golden Horn had been turned back by the chain. The defenders inside the city were few, but they were fighting with a ferocity that came from knowing there was no alternative. There had been discussions in Mehmed's council of abandoning the siege. A European relief fleet had been rumored, might yet come, and Mehmed knew that a failed siege would damage his prestige and perhaps his hold on power. He decided to attempt something that had never been done in the history of naval warfare. He would move his ships overland. The Golden Horn was blocked by the chain. But the land north of the city was not defended in the same way. Mehmed had his engineers construct a road of greased logs from the Bosphorus shore, over the hill of Galata, and down to the upper waters of the Golden Horn above the chain. And across this road, his men hauled 70 ships, hauled them on wheeled cradles, pulled by oxen and human muscle, through the night of the 22nd of April, an operation of staggering logistical audacity that moved a fleet of warships across a hill and set them floating in waters where the defenders had believed themselves safe. When dawn came on the 23rd and the Byzantines looked out and saw Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn, in their harbor, behind their chain, the effect on morale was devastating. It was not so much the military threat, though that was real, as the sense that the rules had changed, that someone had found a way around the thing that had always seemed impossible. The days that followed were the hardest. The defenders were stretched thinner, now needing to watch the Golden Horn Wall as well as the great land walls to the west. The cannon continued its slow, methodical destruction. Mehmed rode along the outside of the walls on a white horse, surveying the breaches, calculating. His engineers were digging mines beneath the walls, and the defenders inside were digging countermines, and sometimes the two groups of men, each digging in the dark earth toward the other, would break through into the same tunnel and fight by torchlight in a space barely large enough to stand. Above them, the city prayed and the spring sky deepened into the beautiful blue of late May. The night of the 28th of May was a night of extraordinary solemnity. Everyone in the city who could walk came to the Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic together, the theological differences that had divided them set aside for this one night, and the Emperor Constantine came, and the priests chanted the ancient liturgy in the great space under the great dome, and the candles burned. And the faces of the saints in the mosaics looked down from the gilded walls as they had looked down for 900 years, serene and distant and grave. Constantine, after the service was over, rode along the walls one last time, stopping to speak with his officers and with ordinary soldiers, giving thanks, asking forgiveness for any wrong he had done them. He spoke to the Venetians and the Genoese who had stayed to fight alongside his people. He went to the palace and asked forgiveness of his household. And then he returned to the walls, where he intended to spend the night. He left the palace for the last time before dawn on the 29th of May. It is this detail, small and human, that catches at something. He had lived in that palace, had walked through those corridors and looked out from those windows at the water below, and he closed the door behind him and walked through the sleeping city to the walls, not knowing that the door would never be opened from the inside again. The final assault began in the hours before dawn. Mehmed sent his irregular troops first, the Bashibazuks, irregulars from the margins of his empire, sent against the walls not because he expected them to break through but because he wanted to exhaust the defenders before the main assault. They came in waves, shouting, carrying scaling ladders, and they were fought back, and they came again. And the defenders on the walls were already tired, 53 days of siege tired, the deep bone weariness of people who have slept in short intervals and eaten poorly and watched their numbers dwindle and their walls crumble. And still they fought the irregulars back. Then came the Anatolian regulars, better trained, better equipped, and the fighting at the walls became harder, and still the Byzantines held. And then the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, professional soldiers of extraordinary discipline and training, the finest fighting force in the world at that moment, advanced toward the section of wall known as the Blachurny, in the northern part of the land wall circuit. There was a postern gate, a small door in the wall, used for minor traffic in peaceful times, called the Kirkeporta. Somehow, in the confusion of the battle, it had been left unbolted. Some accounts say it had been used for a sortie and not properly secured afterward. Others suggest negligence or treachery. Whatever the reason, a group of Ottoman soldiers found it, pushed it open, and came through the wall from the outside, not over it, not through a breach blasted by cannon, but through a door left ajar in the night. They climbed to the top of the wall above it, and raised the Ottoman standard, and when the defenders saw it they faltered, and the sense of impossibility that had been keeping men on their feet for 53 days suddenly shifted into something else. And then Giovanni Giustiniani was hit. A bolt from a crossbow, or perhaps from a handgun, the sources disagree on the weapon, agree on the wound, struck him in the gap between his breastplate and his arm, and the wound was serious enough that he asked to be carried from the wall. Constantine is said to have pleaded with him to stay, understanding what his departure would mean for morale, and Giustiniani asked for the key to the gate behind the wall so that he could be carried through. He was taken to a Genoese ship in the harbor and died, probably, a few days later. When the finest soldier on the Byzantine side was seen being carried away wounded, the defenders' resolve broke. Men began to abandon the walls. The Janissaries, seeing the wavering, pressed harder. Constantine XI was last seen, by the accounts that have come down to us, on horseback near the breach in the walls, in the midst of the fighting, as the Ottoman soldiers poured through. He is said to have torn off his imperial insignia, the purple cloak, the symbols of the dynasty that stretched back to Constantine the Great, so that he would not be taken alive and humiliated. He rode into the press of battle. And then the accounts lose him. No body was ever certainly identified. Some later sources claim to have found him among the fallen by his purple boots, the mark of the emperor, still on his feet. Others said he was never found at all. He disappeared into the confusion of that hour before dawn, the last emperor of Byzantium, and did not come out of it. Let the night settle around you. Let the detail of that hour, the shouting, the firelight, the running feet on the ancient stones, let it grow quieter now, more distant, the way sounds grow quiet when you move away from them. What happened in the streets of Constantinople on the morning of the 29th of May, 1453 was a thing of great violence and great sorrow. And it does not need to be described in detail here, in the dark, in the late hour. There was looting. There was killing. There was grief on a scale that stunned even those who had caused it. The city that had been the queen of cities for 1100 years was, in a single morning, something different. Mehmed the Conqueror entered Constantinople on horseback later that afternoon. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia. The accounts say that he dismounted at the entrance and bent down to take a handful of earth, which he poured over his turban, a gesture of humility before God, or perhaps simply a human gesture in the face of something larger than himself. Inside the great church, the last liturgy had ended only hours before. The mosaics still looked down from the walls. The dome still floated in the light. Mehmed stood in the nave of the greatest building in the Christian world and gave thanks, and ordered that it be converted to a mosque, and a muezzin climbed to the highest point of the building and called the prayer. And the sound of that call filled the space under the dome for the first time, and bounced from the ancient walls, and went out through the high windows into the May afternoon. The city that Mehmed entered was not the city that Constantine the Great had founded. It was a city of ghosts and gardens, of magnificent ruins and abandoned palaces, of churches still lit with the oil lamps of faith in a population too small for the space it occupied. And yet it was still, unmistakably, one of the most beautiful places on earth. The setting alone, the peninsula between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, the blue water on every horizon, the hills rising behind, was enough to make a person understand why, of all the places in the world, this was the one that emperors and sultans and generals had spent centuries trying to possess. Mehmed is reported to have stood in the ruins of the great palace of the Byzantine emperors and recited a verse from the Persian poet Ferdowsi. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. It was a line about the ruins of ancient greatness, about the way time undoes everything, and Mehmed reciting it in the ruins of the very place it described was either a moment of genuine feeling or of carefully constructed theater. Possibly both. He was 21 years old and he had just conquered Constantinople, and he was a man who read poetry, and he was standing in a palace that had housed the heirs of Rome for 1,000 years. Mehmed was not a destroyer. This is a fact that complicates any simple understanding of what happened that day. He had the mosaics plastered over rather than destroyed, because plaster can be removed, and indeed, many of those mosaics survived beneath their plaster covering for centuries, until they were uncovered in the 20th century and restored. He was genuinely interested in the city he had won, and in the intellectual and cultural traditions it represented. He invited the scattered scholars of Byzantium to remain, and some did. He appointed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch. The institution of the patriarchate survived, and survives still, and guaranteed certain rights to the Christian population. He brought repopulation to the devastated city by encouraging and sometimes compelling settlement by people from across his empire. Within a generation, the city was growing again, filling with new life, becoming the capital of what would be one of the great empires of the following 4 centuries. In the weeks and months before the final siege, and in the years leading up to it, a stream of people had been leaving Constantinople, scholars and churchmen and wealthy families who could read the signs and had the means to go. They took with them what could be carried, manuscripts above all, the irreplaceable texts of the ancient world in their Byzantine copies, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and packed into chests, and loaded onto ships in the harbor of the Golden Horn. A man named Bessarion, a Byzantine scholar who had converted to Catholicism and been made a cardinal by the Pope, had been gathering Greek manuscripts for years and would eventually donate his collection to Venice, forming the nucleus of what became the Bibliotheca Marciana, one of the great libraries of Europe. Others brought their manuscripts to Florence, to Rome, to wherever a patron could be found who valued such things. The Greek texts that the scholars of the Italian Renaissance so urgently wanted to study, the works of Plato in particular, which had been less widely known in the medieval West than the works of Aristotle, came to them through this dispersal, carried in the hands of people who were homeless and grieving and desperately looking for a new place to belong. The scholars who fled Constantinople before and after the fall, carrying with them manuscripts and memories, and the habits of mind of a civilization that had spent 1,100 years thinking carefully about philosophy and theology and mathematics, scattered across Europe, settling primarily in Italy. In Venice and Florence and Rome they arrived with their Greek texts and their Greek learning, and they contributed to a flowering of intellectual life that was already beginning and that would become what we call the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople is thus one of the hinges of history, an ending that was also, in unexpected ways, a beginning, a dispersal that seeded new growth in places the original plant had never reached. The Hagia Sophia stood for another 5 centuries as a mosque, and in the 20th century it was made a secular museum, and then in the 21st century it was made a mosque again. These changes of use are not changes to the building itself, which persists in a way that makes the human argument about what it should be feel almost beside the point. The dome still floats. The light still pours in through the ring of windows in that way that the original architects engineered so carefully, the way that made ambassadors from the far north say they could not tell if they were in heaven or on earth. The building has outlasted every argument about itself, and it will likely outlast several more. The Bosphorus, tonight, is exactly what it always was. The water moves through the strait from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara in a current of 3 or 4 knots, steady and cold and indifferent to the things that have happened on its shores. Ships still cross it. Fishermen still sit on the bridges above it, their lines trailing in the dark water, waiting with the patience that fishing requires. On the hill above the European shore, the minarets of the Hagia Sophia are lit against the dark sky, 4 of them, slender and white, rising from the corners of the ancient building like punctuation. The dome in between them is also lit, a great dark curve against the stars. From the water, in the night, it is possible to see why people have always felt about this building the way they do. It is massive and it is serene and it has the quality, rare in human-made things, of seeming to belong not to any particular century or faith or political arrangement but simply to the place itself, to this specific point where the continent bends toward the water and the water turns toward the sea. There is a kind of sorrow in the story of Constantinople that is different from ordinary historical sorrow. It is not simply the sorrow of defeat, or of a civilization ending. Civilizations end, and something else begins, and the world goes on, and that is not only sad. It is something more specific, the sorrow of continuity broken. The people of Constantinople had maintained, for 1100 years, a sense of themselves as the inheritors of Rome, of the ancient world, of a particular chain of spiritual and intellectual transmission that ran back through the early church and through Greek philosophy to the very foundations of Western thought as they understood it. And that chain, that sense of themselves as custodians of something irreplaceable, was broken on the 29th of May 1453. Not destroyed, the manuscripts survived, the scholars dispersed but lived on, the patriarchate continued, but interrupted, changed into something that could never again be quite the same thing it had been. The Venetian sailors who were in the city and managed to escape on their ships, rowing hard through the chaos of that morning, they carried the news westward across the Mediterranean, and as the news spread through the cities of Europe in the weeks and months that followed, the response was something like the response to the death of someone very old and very important who has been ill for a long time. You knew it was coming. You had told yourself you were prepared. And then it came, and you discovered that you were not prepared at all, that knowing a thing is inevitable does not prevent the knowledge of its arrival from striking you with full force. Kings and popes wrote letters and wept and vowed crusades that never came to anything. Artists and scholars sought out the refugees from Constantinople and sat with them and listened to what they had to say. And slowly, over the following decades and centuries, the world arranged itself around the new fact, as it always does, as it always will. Let your thoughts quiet now, if they will. The night is very deep. The Bosphorus is dark between its shores, and the current moves through the strait in its steady way, unhurried, indifferent to the hour. Somewhere on the water, a light moves, a ship making its crossing, its navigation lights tracing a slow arc from Asia to Europe or Europe to Asia, the passage that has been made 10,000 times 10,000 in both directions, merchants and soldiers and refugees and scholars and fishermen and lovers and ordinary people going about the business of their ordinary lives, crossing the narrow water between the two halves of the world. Constantine XI Palaiologos is remembered in the Eastern Orthodox tradition as a saint and a martyr, the last emperor, the man who chose to die on the walls of his city rather than surrender or flee. Whether the Orthodox Church has formally canonized him depends on which account you read, but among the Greek people his memory has always carried that quality, the quality of someone who did what was required of him at the worst possible moment, who did not diminish himself when diminishment was the easier option. Whatever he felt in those last hours, and we cannot know, we can only imagine, he met the morning with his boots on and his city behind him. It is not nothing. In the long catalogue of human failure under pressure, it is genuinely not nothing. The Judas trees that bloomed in Constantinople in May of 1453 bloom again every May, as they always have, as they always will. That particular rose-purple, concentrated and intense, in the gardens and along the old walls and scattered through the hills above the water. The spring comes to the city every year regardless of what name the city carries or what prayers are said in which language inside the great building on the hill. The swallows that nest in the caves of the ancient walls return from Africa every spring on the same routes their great-great-great-grandparents flew before the first stone of the city was laid. The Bosphorus runs its cold course from the Black Sea toward the Marmara, as it has run since long before there was anyone on its shores to name it, and will run long after the last of the names we have given it have been forgotten. Let the image of the water hold you now. The Bosphorus in the dark. The lights on both shores, Europe and Asia, the two halves of the world pressing close across that narrow channel, close enough that you might imagine reaching out from one shore and touching the other, though of course you cannot. The water is always between, always moving, always cold and always patient. The stars above the strait are very bright. They have seen everything that has happened on these shores, and they will see everything that is coming, and they do not diminish or brighten or change their courses for any of it. They simply persist, in their enormous patience, lighting the sky above the old city and above the water and above the sleeping hills on both sides of the strait, as they were lighting it on the morning of the 29th of May 1453, as they will light it on every morning that follows. Sleep is a kind of crossing. You set out from one shore, the shore of wakefulness, of thought and memory and the weight of things, and you move through the dark water, and you arrive somewhere else, somewhere quieter and deeper, where the events of history are very far away and the only thing that matters is the slow current of breath moving in and out, steady as the Bosphorus in the night. Let that crossing begin now, if it will. The body knows the way. It has made this crossing every night of your life, without effort, without instruction, finding its own path through the dark to the other shore. The great dome is quiet. The mosaics sleep behind their coverings, or shine in restored gold in the rooms where they have been uncovered, the faces of the saints serene and unhurried in the way that only very old things achieve serenity, not the serenity of people who have never suffered but of things that have lasted, that have been present through everything and come through still standing, still themselves. The water outside moves in its old course. The stars turn in their old patterns. The city sleeps, as it has slept on 10,000 nights before this one, and will sleep on 10,000 nights to come. Let your breathing slow all the way now. Let the muscles of your face release, the muscles of your shoulders, the long muscles of your back that have been holding you up through the day. Let them soften and release and sink. You are very close to the other shore. The water is dark and still here, at the deep part of the crossing, and there is nothing required of you, no decision, no effort, no memory. Only the breath. Only the dark water. Only the patient stars. The walls are still standing in places. The great Theodosian walls, battered and repaired and battered again across their long life, stand still along the western edge of the old city, their stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, their towers broken in some places and in others almost whole. Grass grows between the stones. Cats sleep in the afternoon sun on the old battlements. Wild flowers push up through the cracks, small yellow and white blooms that arrive every spring without invitation, finding their purchase in the ancient mortar as they have found it in every spring since the walls were built, patient in the way that small plants are patient, asking nothing, needing very little, content with a crack and a season of sun. It is very quiet there, in the evenings, with the swallows circling in the last light and the city behind you and the long plain in front of you where the armies came and finally, on one May morning, came through. Standing beside those walls in the soft hour before dark, you can feel the weight of what was held here, not abstractly, not as a historical concept, but as something almost physical, something in the air and in the stone and in the way the light falls across the ancient battlements, gilding the worn edges of masonry that has outlasted every name given to the civilization that raised it. The walls held for 1100 years. That, too, is not nothing. Sleep now. The Bosphorus keeps its watch. The walls hold their long patience. The stars are very close.